Good day, everyone. This lecture will be on the first part of my hormone lecture series. These are our objectives. For this session, we will classify the different hormones into subgroups according to chemical properties and mode of synthesis. So here are the different ways of classifying hormones. So we can classify them according to chemical composition, according to solubility properties, and location of receptors, and lastly, your mechanism of action. So when we classify hormones according to their chemical composition. So you would see here, there are those that are derived from cholesterol. Okay, there are those that are derived from amino acids, so tyrosine derivatives. There are those that come from a series of amino acids, so they are peptides of various sizes. And there are those that actually incorporate carbohydrates, and they are called your complex polypeptides or your glycoproteins. So going back to your cholesterol derivatives, so we know that cholesterol has 27 carbons, and our hormones usually have 21 carbons. So in this particular examples here, you have progesterone, okay, and cortisol, which have 21 carbons. For your testosterone, it has 19, and then estradiol has 18. You will see that the A, B, C, and D rings of cholesterol is preserved. The difference would be in the functional groups that are attached to these molecules. So addition of different functional groups would lead to a different activity. So this is vitamin D. So it's actually still similar to your cholesterol, except that the B ring is cleaved. Now for your tyrosine derivatives, you have your thyroid hormones and your catecholamines. So we know for a fact tyrosine actually is derived also from phenylalanine, which is an amino acid. And then later when we discuss the synthesis, we will see how we will end up with your catecholamines. Likewise with your thyroid hormones. Now, when we look at its chemical composition, we see that one ring is incorporated into your catecholamines, whereas you have two rings here in your thyroid hormones. Now, this is important because this affects the solubility of this molecule. So for your catecholamines, which only have one ring, you have sequential addition of functional groups that increase its solubility in water so that your catecholamines are water soluble. Whereas for your thyroid hormones, because it has two rings, it renders it more nonpolar, and that's why your thyroid hormones are lipid soluble. Going back to your cholesterol derivatives, because of the preservation also of your rings here, and we know that cholesterol is lipid soluble, then your cholesterol hormones, the hormones that are derived from cholesterol, are actually lipid soluble. So this is important to remember because we will discuss this in other classifications. For your peptides of various sizes, we see here that you have amino acids. So it can be as short as your thyroid releasing hormone, having only 3 amino acids. And you have here your ACTH, which is composed of a series of amino acids. It is good to note that ACTH is just one of the 4 hormones that can be cleaved from your POMC protein. So your pro-opiomelanocortin gene will synthesize this protein, and then ACTH is one of those 4 hormones derived from it. Now, the good thing about your peptides, remember when you discuss amino acids, You have basic, acidic, you have polar, nonpolar, linear, cyclic. So this actually would affect the solubility of your amino acids. Now for your peptides, if you remember, you have protein folding. So your non-polar amino acids would usually hide deep inside the molecules, and only the water-soluble amino acids are left on the surface. So your polypeptide hormones are usually water-soluble. So it's because you have your non-polar amino acids hidden deep inside your molecule. Now, for your glycoproteins, so your TSH, FSH, LH, or HCG, okay? So they usually have carbohydrates that are included in the chain. So we're done with chemical composition. We've introduced the solubility aspect. So let's proceed to solubility properties. So this table 41-4, is in Harper's. So it actually shows us the comparison of your group 1 and group 2 hormones. Your group 1 hormones are lipid soluble. So your 1 looks like a small letter L, so it's easier for you to remember. For group 2 hormones, these are water soluble hormones. So you would see examples of your group 1 hormones, your steroid hormones, your thyroid hormones, okay, your vitamin D, your vitamin A. Now, for your group 2 hormones, these are your polypeptides, no, your glycoproteins, other proteins, your catecholamines. So as mentioned, as to solubility, your group 1 hormones are lipophilic, whereas your group 2 are hydrophilic. So since your group 1 hormones are lipophilic, then they need transport proteins because they cannot freely travel in the blood. And we know that blood is made up of a big percent of your water. So it needs a transport protein for it to get to its target organ. Now for your group 2 hormones, since they are already water soluble, they don't need your transport protein. As to plasma half-life, because your steroid hormones or your lipid-soluble hormones are bound to your transport proteins, that's why they stay longer in the plasma. So they spend more time in the plasma, and as long as they are bound to their transport protein, they are not active. So that's why for your group 2 hormones, they only have a short plasma half-life because they're soluble in water and they are active. So for the placement of the receptors, since your lipid-soluble hormones can pass through the phospholipid bilayer, then it can easily pass through your cell membrane and attach to intracellular receptors. Whereas for your group 2 hormones, which are water-soluble, they cannot pass through your plasma membranes, and hence their receptors are found on your plasma membrane. Now, for your mediators, the mediator of the signal would be your receptor hormone complex for your group 1 hormones, whereas for your group 2 hormones, since they can only attach to plasma membrane receptors, they need to generate second messengers. So these are the ones that carry out the signal intended by your first messenger, which is your hormone. So examples of which are cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP, your calcium. Okay, so metabolites of your complex phosphoinositols and your kinase cascades. So the third classification is the location of receptors. So we've introduced this part in my discussion in the previous slides. So this picture is not in Harper's, but this clearly gives us an illustration that for your group 1 hormones, which are lipid soluble, okay, they can pass through your cell membrane. Therefore, their receptors are found intracellularly. They may be cytoplasmic or they can be nuclear. So in this picture, we could see that steroid hormones would bind to cytoplasmic receptors, whereas your thyroid hormones go directly to your nucleus where they have nuclear receptors. In comparison, your group 2 hormones, which are water-soluble, they cannot pass through your plasma membrane, hence they need a membrane receptor. And after the binding of the hormone with the receptor, they generate a second messenger, which is the one that carries out the intent, the original intent or the original message of your first messenger. So as to mechanism of action, the mechanism of action is actually inherent to their solubility properties. So this table is found in Harper's. So it's in the first few pages of the chapter. So you can classify hormones according to this way. So first would be hormones that bind to intracellular receptors. Okay, so examples of which, so it would be nice if you would remember these particular hormones. And then you have those hormones that bind to cellular cell surface receptors. So here you would see an example of those that would generate cyclic AMP as second messengers. So take a look at these different hormones that would use it. So it's important because I might ask questions regarding this. You also have those that generate cyclic GMP, such as your natriuretic factor and your nitric oxide. Here you would see there are second messengers that generate, like calcium is one of those that are generated, or your phosphatidylinositols, or they can be both. So these are the hormones that usually use this. Okay, acetylcholine, your alpha-2 adrenergic catecholamines, angiotensin 2, and the like. And then lastly, you have those that use kinase or phosphatase cascade. If you look at the hormones under this particular group, you would notice that they are related to growth. Okay, so your insulin-like growth factors, your growth hormones, fibroblast growth factor, erythropoietin, and the like. Okay, so now we will proceed with how hormones are synthesized. So we will discuss an example of which. For thyroid hormone synthesis, so this picture is in chapter 41. So it's 41-11 in that Harper's. So you will look at this picture and you will see, so this is your follicular cell. Okay, so in this part here on the upper part is where your colloid is. And here underneath, this is your blood vessel or your extracellular space. So remember, your thyroid gland contains the highest concentration of iodine in the body. So the first step, which is iodide trapping, is where iodide in the blood, okay, is pumped into your follicular cell with the help of your sodium iodide symporter powered by your sodium potassium ATPase. So it goes against a concentration gradient. That's why you need this sodium iodide symporter to be powered. Okay, so your iodide goes in and it goes directly to your colloid. It goes to your colloid because that's where your peroxidase enzyme is, and it has to undergo oxidation, so it loses its negative sign. So it's from iodide to your iodine, so no more negative sign. And then it also meets up with your thyroglobulin. So your thyroglobulin is a protein, no, which is synthesized in your endoplasmic reticulum inside your follicular cell. So once it is complete, it is also exocytosed to your colloid. So that's where your iodine and your thyroglobulin will meet. So in this part, you have the next step, which is the iodinification of your thyroglobulin or iodination of your thyroglobulin or your organification. The organification of thyroglobulin. So here you would see that the tyrosines on your thyroglobulin, okay, will gain your iodines. So if you have one iodine attached, that's your monoiodothyronine. If you have two, you have the diiodothyronine. After this, you have another step, which is your coupling or your conjugation, wherein two nearby tyrosine residues, okay, can combine. So you end up with a T3 or a T4. So T3 if there is coupling between a monoiodo and a diiodothyronine. And for your T4 precursor, if you have two diiodothyronines. Now, once there is a physiologic cue, then this is endocytosed into your follicular cell, and it meets up with your lysosomes, where your lysosomal proteases will cleave the peptide bonds that bind your T3 and T4 precursors. So what happens next is, because of this, then your T3 and T4 can now be secreted by your thyroid gland. Meanwhile, you can see that some of those on your thyroglobulin are still in the mono and diiodo versions. So it will just repeat the same process. And then you will see here that your T3, T4 is released. So like we said, it's lipid soluble, so it needs a transport protein. Next, we will talk about epinephrine synthesis. So in epinephrine, we mentioned earlier that your tyrosines are actually derived from phenylalanine. So from phenylalanine, you have a hydroxyl reaction. If you remember your conference on PKU and AKU, so a hydroxylation reaction added this hydroxyl group, and then it's now tyrosine. So from tyrosine, you have another hydroxylation reaction, and this is the hydroxyl group attached. You end up with DOPA. So from DOPA to dopamine, you have a decarboxylation reaction, and it's this one, okay, that is removed. So now we have your dopamine. Okay, from dopamine, we now have another hydroxylation reaction. So there's the addition of the hydroxyl group here, and you end up with norepinephrine. So you will see we sequentially added hydroxyl groups, which actually renders this molecule more water-soluble. That's why your catecholamines are water-soluble hormones. Now, from norepinephrine to epinephrine, so we need the action of your phenylethanolamine and methyltransferase enzyme to transfer your methyl group onto your nitrogen here. So here you now have epinephrine. Now let's proceed to your polypeptide hormone synthesis. This picture is in chapter 42 of Harper's. It gives us an idea of the information pathway. So if you look at this picture, you would see that for polypeptide hormones, everything begins from your gene. From the gene, transcription will occur, eventually leading to the formation of your mRNA. Now, this mRNA is transported to your cytoplasm where it is translated by your tRNA. So it goes to your ribosomes first and translated by your tRNA, and you end up with your protein. So this protein that is produced will proceed to your Golgi apparatus where you will have further modification by also addition of functional groups, and there will also be degradation of those parts that are needed for your hormone. Several hormones are made from larger peptide precursors. Formation of the critical disulfide bridges and insulin requires that this hormone be first synthesized as part of a larger precursor molecule, proinsulin. Several other hormones are synthesized as parts of large precursor molecules, not because of some special structural requirement, but rather as a mechanism for controlling the available amount of the active hormone. Insulin is synthesized as a pre-prohormone and modified within the beta cell. Insulin has an A-B heterodimeric structure with one intrachain and two interchain disulfide bridges. Insulin is synthesized as a pre-prohormone with molecular weight of around 11,500, which is the prototype for peptides that are processed from larger precursor molecules. The hydrophobic 23 amino acid pre or leader sequence directs the molecule into the cisternae of the endoplasmic reticulum and then is removed. This results in the 9,000 molecular weight proinsulin molecule, which provides the conformation necessary for the proper and efficient formation of the disulfide bridges. The sequence of proinsulin starting from the amino terminus is B chain. Then your connecting peptide or your C peptide, and then your A chain. The proinsulin molecule undergoes a series of site-specific peptide cleavages that result in the formation of equimolar amounts of your mature insulin and your C-peptide. Another example of a hormone coming from a large precursor molecule is your parathyroid hormone. So this is your pre-pro-parathyroid hormone. It's a 115 amino acid hormone wherein you have 25 amino acids on the N-terminal. When this is cleaved, this yields your pro-parathyroid hormone, which is 84 amino acids. It has a highly basic hexapeptide on your N-terminal. So when this is cleaved, you end up with your 34 amino acid parathyroid hormone, which has full biologic activity. And your 25 to 34 amino acid region is usually the one responsible for receptor binding. The biosynthesis of parathyroid hormone and its subsequent secretion are regulated by the plasma ionized calcium concentration through a complex process. An acute decrease of calcium results in a marked increase of parathyroid hormone mRNA, and this is followed by an increased rate of parathyroid hormone synthesis and secretion. There is quick degradation of your pro-parathyroid hormone that was synthesized. Now, the rate of degradation of your pro-parathyroid hormone decreases when calcium concentrations are low, and it increases when calcium concentrations are high. A calcium receptor on the surface of the parathyroid cell mediates this effect. Very specific fragments of parathyroid hormone are generated during its proteolytic digestion. A number of proteolytic enzymes, including cathepsins B and D, have been identified in parathyroid tissue. Cathepsin B cleaves parathyroid hormone into two fragments. So here, this is your amino acids 1 up to 36. And then you have amino acids 37 up to 84. So this last fragment here is not further degraded. However, for this part here, this is rapidly and progressively cleaved into di and tripeptides. Most of the proteolysis of PTH occurs within the gland, but a number of studies confirm that PTH, once secreted, is proteolytically degraded in other tissues, especially the liver, by similar mechanisms. Angiotensin II is also synthesized from a large precursor. So this is your angiotensinogen. So it's a large alpha-2 globulin made in the liver, is a substrate for renin, an enzyme produced in the juxtaglomerular cells of the renal afferent arteriole. The position of these cells makes them particularly sensitive to blood pressure changes, and many of the physiologic regulators of renin release act through renal baroreceptors. Now, your angiotensin converting enzyme, or your ACE, it's a glycoprotein found in the lung, endothelial cells, and plasma, and it actually removes two carboxy-terminal amino acids from the decapeptide angiotensin 1 to form your angiotensin 2 in a step that is not thought to be rate limiting. So various nona-peptide analogs of angiotensin 1 and other compounds act as competitive inhibitors of converting enzyme and are used to treat renin-dependent hypertension. So these are referred to as your ACE inhibitors. Your angiotensin 2 increases blood pressure by causing vasoconstriction of the arteriole and is a very potent vasoactive substance. It inhibits renin release from the juxtaglomerular cells and is a potent stimulator of aldosterone production. This results in sodium retention, volume expansion, and increased blood pressure. In some species, angiotensin 2 is converted to heptapeptide angiotensin 3, an equally potent stimulator of aldosterone production. In humans, the plasma level of angiotensin 2 is 4 times greater than that of angiotensin 3, so most effects are exerted by the octapeptide. Angiotensins 2 and 3 are rapidly inactivated by angiotensinases. Angiotensin 2 binds to specific adrenal cortex glomerulosa cell receptors. The hormone receptor interaction does not activate adenylyl cyclase, and cyclic AMP does not appear to mediate the action of this hormone. These actions of angiotensin 2, which are to stimulate the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone and of corticosterone to 18-hydroxycorticosterone and aldosterone, may involve changes in the concentration of intracellular calcium and of phospholipid metabolites by mechanisms similar to those that has been previously described. So in this picture, you would see your angiotensinogen here, and which will be cleaved later on to the first 10 amino acids. So it's a decapeptide, and as mentioned earlier, there are 2 amino acids that are cleaved on the carboxy terminal side. Okay, and then it will yield to your octapeptide, your angiotensin 2, as mentioned earlier. If you take a look at here, okay, so there's a nona-peptide version comprised of amino acids 1 to 9, and here amino acids 2 to 10. So furthermore, it can produce your heptapeptide, or here, okay, another heptapeptide. So this is your angiotensin 3 that was mentioned earlier. Another example of hormones that come from a very large precursor would be hormones coming from your POMC family or your pro-opiomelanocortin family. So I've mentioned this already in previous slides. Now, so the POMC family consists of peptides that act as hormones such as your ACTH, LPH, and your MSH. We also have your endorphins, which act as neurotransmitters or neuromodulators. So POMC is synthesized as a precursor molecule of 267 amino acids and is differently processed in various regions of the pituitary and other tissues. Processing of the human POMC protein in the peripheral tissues, such as your gut, placenta, and male reproductive tract, begins with the removal of the 26 amino acid signal peptide. So removal of the POMC signal peptide generates the 241 amino acid POMC protein. There are 3 polypeptide groups generated from the POMC precursor. So as I mentioned, your ACTH, which can give rise to your alpha MSH with amino acids 1 to 13, and your corticotropin-like intermediate lobe peptide. It also can give rise to your beta-lipotropin, which can yield your beta MSH and 2 of your endorphins. Your beta endorphin, which is from your amino acids 1 to 31, and that one, the other one, which is from amino acids 1 to 27. And you also generate a large N-terminal polypeptide, which generates several forms of your gamma MSH. Mutations of the alpha MSH receptor are linked to a common early onset form of obesity. So this observation has directed additional attention to the POMC peptide hormones in recent years. We now proceed to steroid synthesis. So in steroid synthesis, so just a brief review. So when your ACTH binds to its receptor, okay, so what happens is that it would cause the release of your calcium and also your diacylglycerol, which will activate your protein kinase C and eventually will activate your esterase. Okay, so this esterase is activated so that your cholesterol esters, which is the storage form of your cholesterol, you yield your free cholesterol. Okay? Now, this free cholesterol is then transported inside your mitochondria. Why there? Because that is where your cytochrome P450 side chain cleavage enzyme is located. So it's located in your inner mitochondrial membrane. But to get there, remember your mitochondria is also where your ETC happens. And you know for a fact that you have a polarized membrane. If you remember, you have a negative charge, okay, which drives also the influx of your positive charge later on when you have the formation of your water. Okay, so if you will notice, it cannot, your cholesterol cannot pass through that kind of membrane. So it needs this transport protein. It's also known as your steroidogenic acute regulatory protein. Okay, so this one will transport your cholesterol inside your inner mitochondrial membrane to meet this very important enzyme. So what happens is that your cytochrome P450 side chain cleavage enzyme will cleave 6 carbons, so that 27 carbon cholesterol becomes your 21 carbon pregnenolone. So what happens is that there is sequential hydroxylation for your carbon 22 and then your carbon 20, so that this bond is cleaved, and you now have your isocaproaldehyde and your pregnenolone. So this is the first 21 carbon steroid. So this picture is also found in Harper's. I will not blow this up or enlarge it because you can just refer to this picture in that 41st chapter. So here you would see cholesterol, and with the help of your side chain cleavage enzyme, it yields your first 21 carbon steroid, pregnenolone. So from pregnenolone, if you have the carbon 17 hydroxylated, so here, or you make it into a carbonyl oxygen, okay, you actually lose 2 carbons here. See these 2 carbons. So this path would lead to the formation of your androgens. Okay, so let's go back here. So from pregnenolone, you can have a carbonyl oxygen here. So the hydroxyl group here becomes a carbonyl oxygen and you have a double bond here. This is your progesterone. The same thing if you have the pregnenolone version where you have a hydroxyl group on carbon 17, you do the same, no? You change the hydroxyl group here into your carbonyl oxygen and a double bond, then this is your 17-hydroxy version of your progesterone. Okay, from here, if you have another hydroxylation reaction, okay, so if that happens, then you end up with your glucocorticoids, no? So, but only one hydroxyl group. Another hydroxylation reaction using your 11-beta hydroxylase. So this now becomes your corticosterone and this your cortisol. Now from here, with further reaction, no? So specifically the aldosterone synthase, okay? So this becomes your aldosterone. So this is now your mineralocorticoid, okay? So if you see from the start, no, by the addition or changing of your functional groups, you end up with a different hormone and the function is also different. Okay, so you will see here that if in this process here, you see from pregnenolone up to your aldosterone, and you have here in this pathway, you have the hydroxylation at carbon 17 up to yielding your cortisol. So here you would see that if pregnenolone is hydroxylated at carbon 17, the pathway would lead to the formation of your glucocorticoids. But if there's no hydroxylation happening at carbon 17, then it will favor the pathway leading to the formation of your mineralocorticoids. So I mentioned this about here, okay, wherein your 1720 lyase cleaves 2 carbons, which I said would lead to the androgens, the pathway forming your androgens. So this picture is also found in the 41st chapter. So earlier we discussed your pregnenolone, okay, that can be converted into your progesterone. And later on also, no, we can have with the action of your 1720 lyase. So like I said, it will cleave the 2 carbons here so that you now have your 19 carbons androgen. Okay, so from the 21 carbons of pregnenolone, progesterone, you have your 19 carbons androgens. So all the 21 carbons would be your pregnenolone, progesterone, your corticosteroids, your glucocorticoids, and your mineralocorticoids. Okay, so those have 21 carbons. Now for androgens, you have 19 carbons, courtesy of your 1720 lyase that cleave the 2 carbons here. Now, this would also give you an idea if you have a mutation in this particular enzyme, then you cannot cleave these 2 carbons and you cannot form your androgens. So you can see here the different forms of androgens, and the one with the masculinizing effect is your testosterone. Okay, so what happens is that the testosterone in the periphery will be converted into the more potent version with the help of your 5-alpha reductase. Okay, so this occurs in the periphery. So as an application of this, your male patients that are 40 years old and above would usually start to exhibit symptoms of benign prostatic hypertrophy. So what they do to address this is to give an inhibitor for this enzyme. So it inhibits, okay, the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone in the periphery, okay, by inhibiting 5-alpha reductase. Okay, so here, from your androgens, okay, from your androgens, we can form your estrogen. So we only need to remove 1 carbon. So you would notice that this became aromatic, or in other words, it gained 3 double bonds, no? So the enzyme that makes that possible is aromatase. So again, your androgens have 19 carbons. When you cleave 1 carbon, which is here, found here, then it converts this into an aromatic ring. Okay, so we have your estradiol, your estrone, and your estriol. So from your testosterone, with the help of aromatase, you end up with your estradiol, which is the one with the feminizing effect. Now, from androstenedione, okay, aromatase can also act on it, and we end up with estrone, which is more predominant in postmenopausal women. Okay, now the estriol is synthesized in your placenta. Vitamin D, or your calcitriol, is synthesized from a cholesterol derivative. So we do intake vitamin D3 from the diet. We usually get them from fish liver oil or from your egg yolk, but we can also synthesize this, in the malpighian layer of the epidermis from your 7-dehydrocholesterol. Okay, so this one. If you will see, you have the 4 rings here that is usually seen in cholesterol. Now, in the reaction, because of your UV light, no? So your UV light mediated non-enzymatic photolysis reaction. So you will see that in this structure, the B ring was cleaved. Okay, so it looks like this now. So the extent of this conversion is related directly to the intensity of the exposure and inversely to the extent of pigmentation in the skin. So as we age, no, we actually have a loss in the 7-dehydrocholesterol in the epidermis. So that's why in the older ages, there's a negative calcium balance. And that's why also we supplement with vitamin D in the older ages. So here we are. We have the vitamin D3 version. So what happens is that this is transported using your vitamin D binding protein. So it moves this from the skin, or if it's from the diet, then from your intestine to your liver. Okay? So it is where 25-hydroxylation occurs. So in 25-hydroxylation, so this is your carbon 25, this is the first obligatory reaction in the production of your active vitamin D3 or your calcitriol. So your 25-hydroxylation occurs in the endoplasmic reticulum in a reaction that requires magnesium, NADPH, molecular oxygen, and an uncharacterized cytoplasmic factor. So two enzymes are involved. You have your NADPH-dependent cytochrome P450 reductase and a cytochrome P450. So this reaction is not regulated. Okay, so it also occurs with low efficiency in your kidney and your intestine. So the 25-hydroxycholecalciferol then enters the circulation, where it is the major form of vitamin D found in plasma. So this is then transported to your kidney. So as is, it's still your vitamin D binding protein that transports it. So in the kidney, your 25-hydroxycholecalciferol is a weak agonist and must be modified by hydroxylation at carbon 1. Okay? So in order to have full biologic activity. So this is accomplished in the mitochondria of the renal proximal convoluted tubule by a 3-component monooxygenase reaction that requires NADPH, magnesium, molecular oxygen, and at least 3 enzymes. First being your flavoprotein renal ferredoxin reductase, then your iron sulfur protein renal ferredoxin, and lastly, your cytochrome P450. So this system produces your 125-hydroxycholecalciferol or your calcitriol or your active vitamin D3, which is the most potent naturally occurring metabolite of vitamin D3. Now this table 41.6, would give us an idea about our transport proteins. Okay, so for the receptors and the transport proteins, when we compare them now as to the concentration, your receptors are usually very low, okay? And usually their expression depends on the availability also of your insulin, or I mean your hormone, and the stimulus. Okay, so we also have your transport proteins, which are usually present in very high levels. So the affinity of your receptors to your hormone is very high. For your transport proteins, it is low. That's why usually if they arrive at the target cell, then your hormones are released by your transport proteins and they bind to their receptors with high affinity. As to binding specificity, your receptors have very high specificity compared to your transport proteins. In fact, there are transport proteins that can bind more than one kind of hormone. Saturability, yes, your receptors can be saturated, but for your transport proteins, they are not saturated. For reversibility, both are reversible when your hormone would attach to your receptors or your transport proteins. As to the process of signal transduction, it only occurs with your receptors. So your transport proteins just really does the job of transporting these hormones. This table compares your T4 and T3 in the plasma. So thyroid hormones are transported by your thyroid binding globulin or your TBG. 1/2 to 2/3 of your T4, T3 in the body is in an extrathyroidal reservoir. So they are bound to your TBG, and this has a capacity to bind 20 micrograms per deciliter of plasma. So under normal circumstances, TBG binds non-covalently nearly all of your T4 and T3 in your plasma. However, it binds your T4 with greater affinity than your T3. So take a look at the plasma half-life. So your T4 is 4 to 5 times than that of your T3. The small amount of your unbound or free fraction is responsible for the biologic activity. So despite the great difference in the total amount, the free fraction of your T3 approximates your T4. And given that T3 is intrinsically more active than T4, most biologic activity is attributed to T3. Your thyroid binding globulin does not bind any other hormones. Still on the topic of your transport proteins, your glucocorticoids are transported by your corticosteroid binding globulin. This is actually produced in the liver, and its synthesis is increased by estrogens, so similar to your thyroid binding globulin. Your CBG binds most of the hormone when plasma cortisol levels are within normal range. Much smaller amounts of cortisol are bound to albumin. Cortisol binds tightly to your corticosteroid binding globulin and has a half-life of 1.5 to 2 hours, while corticosterone, which binds less tightly, has a plasma half-life of less than an hour. So the unbound or free cortisol is about 8% of the total and represents the biologically active fraction. Binding to your CBG is not restricted to glucocorticoids, as you can see here in your table. So the oxycorticosterone and your progesterone interact with your CBG with sufficient affinity to compete for cortisol binding. Aldosterone, the most potent natural mineralocorticoid, does not have a specific plasma transport protein. You can also see that your gonadal, steroids, they bind very weakly to your CBG. So the smaller the number, the higher the affinity, the larger the number, the lesser. Now your gonadal steroids are transported by your sex hormone binding globulin. So you can see here that your SHBG, so it has a beta globulin that binds testosterone with specificity, relatively high affinity, and limited capacity. So this hormone is also produced in the liver, and its production is increased by estrogens. So women have twice the serum concentration of SHBG than in men. So even certain types of liver disease and hypothyroidism can also have the same result. It is decreased by androgens, advancing age, and hypothyroidism. Many of these conditions also affect the production of CBG and your TBG. So since your SHBG and albumin bind 97 to 99% of circulating testosterone, only a small fraction of the hormone is in circulation. So that small fraction is biologically active. So therefore, we can say that the primary function of your SHBG may be to restrict the free concentration of testosterone in the serum. Testosterone binds to SHBG with higher affinity than your estradiol. Okay, so if there is a change in the level of your SHBG, then it causes a greater change in the free testosterone level than in your free estradiol level. If you notice, your estrogens are bound to your SHBG, but your progesterone is bound to your CBG. So SHBG binds estradiol around 5 times less avidly than your dihydrotestosterone. And your progesterone and cortisol have little affinity for this protein. In contrast, your progesterone and cortisol bind with nearly equal affinity to your CBG. So, in turn, it has less or little affinity for estradiol and even less for your testosterone and your dihydrotestosterone. So these binding proteins also provide a circulating reservoir of hormone, and because of the relatively large binding capacity, they will buffer against sudden changes in the plasma level.